There was this guy your viewers, I'm sure, probably don't remember, especially if they're younger than we are, named Scott McClellan. He was one of George W. Bush's press secretaries.
Yep.
He leaves around, I want to say 2005, 6, I may be forgetting, and then he writes a memoir. And it's really an interesting document because it's less blame evading and victim creating than your typical like Beltway memoir, Democrat or Republican, general or senior intelligence official, and so on. And this one just sort of marvels from the perspective of White House press secretary at like how little pushback they received throughout the entire prospect, that how they didn't really have to manipulate the media, that it was just pushing on an open door, that the press had gone along with this jingoistic narrative. And like McClellan had this, he just like couldn't conceive of it. And the reason why he couldn't conceive of it is because he hasn't read, Chomsky and Herman, and he doesn't understand the political economy of the media. And is, typically, eager to say like that darn liberal media. And here he was saying, like, I can't believe the liberal media didn't liberal enough, when in fact it was demonstrating really long-standing historical patterns of liberalism, which is going along with these kinds of fiascos instead of, in fact, challenging. And
that's fascinating. All I can think of is Jeff Gannon Guckert when I hear McClellan. Yeah.
Your viewers are not going to remember that. These are deep cuts.
Deep cuts. We'll maybe someday we'll go down the Jeff Gannon Guckert wormhole. But so the press just completely drops the ball. Like, why do you think that was?
They bought into the war on terror. They were terrified of being outside the very limited and deliberately cultivated band of acceptable opinion, which they at the same time on their opinion sides policed. You'll remember that Phil Donahue was like the only anti-war and like very gingerly anti-war.
Yes.
TV host on cable news. He got canned. There was money to be made in the war on terror. There was a spectacle, and there was also a feel-good narrative. And those things are more profitable than ultimately the kind of reporting that you saw from organizations like Knight Ridder that did real national security reporting, that found people in the bowels of the national security state that knew that this was a manufactured crisis and reported it accordingly. And then when they reported it, the major news organizations did not follow that lead and instead doubled down on finding through carefully, presented administration leaks, validation of what the narrative was. Like, for instance, the famous New York Times story about how, Saddam Hussein had gotten these shipments of aluminum tubes. And even though this is not true, only, that could only be destined for a nuclear weapons program and so forth. And that was credulously presented to the American people as fact. And accordingly, every layer you could see of supposed check on power that we are led from the time, we get our first taste of civics in school to believe holds back this sort of ruthless and blatant aggression, not just internationally, but domestically, fails. All of it.
As you say that dynamic with the press, I think the last time we spoke was about your book, Reign of Terror, and how this era that we're talking about destabilized America and in many respects brought us to the point that we're at now with Trump, which on some level, when you say it makes, obvious, like, of course, something that happened 15, 20 years ago would impact where we are today. But the American psyche, as you started off by saying, this interview is such that, like, those are just two different eras and no relationship whatsoever. I always like come back to like Gore Vidal's. I remember at one point Gore Vidal came on the show back in the Air America days and, was talking about the United States of amnesia. And I couldn't really wrap my head around what he was talking about until, I see Michelle Obama hugging George Bush and just sort of like this, the canonization of him. But do you think that dynamic of the media, because I remember Knight Ridder doing this. I remember in the run up to the war, freaking out, and Janine was going on Fox to try and argue against it because she was the only person allowed to go on TV at that time and argue against the war. And reading the Project for a New American Century and reading Knight Ridder and seeing all of this information, but on like page 16 of the newspaper, while the first 15 pages are with the sort of like Atta may have been in Prague. And I wonder if that dynamic, also set the table for stuff like the CDC is saying coronavirus is bad, but this website says it's a plandemic by Bill Gates. We've seen this movie before. Maybe we should just believe that it's a plandemic. I mean, I wonder how much that dynamic where the media was completely kowtowed and missed the story of Iraq for all intents and purposes, sort of softened the ground, as it were, for this complete lack of faith in the media reporting during a pandemic.
And I think what we in the media have not really come to terms with as we look at all this stuff, we're like, oh my God, how could these people believe it? Is that we deserve it. We deserve that lack of faith. We deserve that, immediate, overwhelming, not just skepticism. I think skepticism is a different phenomenon than what we're talking about here, but that hostility. Now, do I believe that there is not also good and reality-based and thorough journalism? Of course not. There is all over if you're willing to look for it. But that ain't going to be what's, put on the airwaves in this sort of jingoistic way that we got used to throughout the war on terror. And it hasn't ended. The legacy of this doesn't go away just because it became such an awful, fiasco. History doesn't reset every time the United States elects a president, particularly of a different party. That's just not how any of this works. And there also wasn't, one of the things that, you saw so much. And here's where I would want to push back a little on what you were kind of saying throughout the last, couple questions about like the mindset of the American people. Tens of millions of people worldwide knew this was nonsense and demonstrated against it.
Without a doubt. And
that meant absolutely nothing to their elected officials. It was denigrated. It was treated as mob rule, irresponsibility, objectively pro-Saddam was something you heard a lot from elite media. There was, I could really go on with that, but the point is that this was a manufactured crisis, and lots of people saw through it, and that will inevitably have an effect, a profound effect, on the way many people, both those who went along with the war and those who opposed the war, people who simply, committed the, very understandable decision to believe what their leaders were telling them at a time of enormous post 9/11 public fear.
Right.
Ultimately, that was a betrayed trust. And I don't think we should blame the people for that. I think we should blame the people who both perpetrated that breach of faith and those who enabled it. And those structural imbalances persist today, and their legacies persist.
I accept that correction. I mean, I think to a certain extent too, though. I remember the sort of real intense violence towards or threat of violence towards people who were vocal in opposing the war. I mean, it was
Absolutely.
the hostility level and was super intense. These people were very, very emboldened.
And this is one of the ways you can see a bit of the I don't want to call it a beta test, but a bit of a precursor condition to the kind of environment you would see, really regnant on the right now in the age of MAGA. However much MAGA however much MAGA insists upon disavowing any relationship it had with the architects of the Iraq War. The war on terror, and certainly at the time of the war in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, was an opportunity to sort real Americans, those who went along with this, from conditional Americans, those who did not go along with it or are from the wrong, race, religion, socioeconomic background, and so forth. That is how manufactured hysteria has always worked. It works in this case. It works extremely well. It has a very powerful heritage from the Cold War, and we can't pretend like the war on terror is the first time this ever happened. The reason why it's so familiar in this respect, the reason why we can trace these lineages is because of how American and how familiar it is, because of the way this is how the United States, you can really, you can make arguments about this being the case going back to 1619. You can make a case about this going back to, the Mexican-American War, which is, sold entirely on a lie and is how we got most of the Western states. You can go back to Vietnam. You can certainly go to the Cold War period, where you get an easy justification for saying who is truly American and who is not by who stands with this crusade of the elites that preserves, call it what you want, capitalist dominance, white supremacist capitalist dominance, and so on.